All right, so welcome to our webinar on succession planning and elections. This is part of our monthly program quality webinar series. We're going to talk about our agenda for tonight. So we're going to talk about succession planning, all the steps that you can take to set your club up for a successful new year. We're going to talk about nominations, how that process works. Then we'll move into the election process, our Q&A, and then finally the raffle. So let's talk about succession planning. So the first question is why? Why is succession planning so important to our club success? Well, the first item is it helps to cement your legacy as an officer and of the club. And the things here to recognize is that a good succession plan will continue current initiatives that the previous officers have already established. It'll maintain a positive ambiance in the club, having consistent leadership year after year. The success of the club is really dependent on good officers. So making sure you have a good succession plan, make sure that your club has good leadership going forward. So officers do work behind the scenes to keep the club going. So you have to make sure that things like your dues are getting paid, make sure contests are ran, make sure your roles are filled for your meetings. Got to make sure that things like that come up that need to be troubleshooted by the officers. You know, maybe you need to find a new meeting location because the one you're using isn't available. Things like that all happen behind the scenes, and it's because of your club officers. So you want to make sure you have the good leadership that will be able to do those things in the following year. Clubs that have great leadership one year but don't have it the next year are going to have problems. They tend to crumble very quickly under bad leadership. So having a good succession plan is really important. The other thing a good succession plan will hopefully do is eliminate burnout, because not the same people are going to keep taking the same roles year after year. You want to have transitions so that others have the opportunity to be leaders in your club, and those that have already served don't have to keep serving year after year. So who are the people that are responsible for putting the succession planning together? So all of the current officers should be a part of your succession planning. They should be the ones that are identifying people who they want to approach that might be a good candidate to replace them in the upcoming year. Who can be a candidate at your specific position is something that every officer should be asking themselves. You know, being a good leader is largely about creating leaders. So being a mentor, looking for those qualified people and potential leaders is really important. You can approach the person informally, even if not part of the nominations committee, and anyone can suggest candidates to the nominations committee. So that's really important. You know, so getting started, the first step is identifying those candidates. You know, think about who you want to work with. So if you're going to continue on as an officer the following year, who else do you want to work with as part of your team? You know, think about where you fit in that plan. Are you going to be an officer next year, or are you going to support the officers? You know, it's really important to, you know, plant the seed in people's minds. So if you think someone might be a good candidate, you know, approach them and say, you know, I think you'd be really good at this job, and start that conversation with them. And it's important to ask your team for their opinion on who you think is a good candidate. So talking to your fellow officers and letting them know, hey, this is who I've identified I think would make a good candidate, and asking them for their opinion. It's really important early on in the succession planning to approach potential candidates. You know, have a good conversation with them. You know, you can start off with an email, but make sure you have an actual conversation. Be prepared to explain your role that you currently serve in. So how much, and here's some questions that you can make sure you want to answer when you're approaching a potential candidate. Questions like, how much time do you spend is a really important question. What exactly do you do in your position? How did this position interact with your work, home life? Was the work done mostly over email or in person? Some roles really require showing up to most every meeting, so it's important that people understand what their commitment is. If you're going to become president of your club, you probably want to be at every meeting. Same thing with sergeant at arms. Really, all positions have some form of commitment. You want to make sure you set those expectations. So make sure people understanding those commitments. Things to consider when also finding a candidate. So a good candidate, you want to factor in their own personality, their own experience. Depending on the position, it's really important, to understand, what their experience is, not just only in Toastmasters, but also what leadership experience do they have outside of Toastmasters. For higher positions, think of people with experience with other officer roles so they can understand the challenges that their team will face. So if one of my roles is president, VP of education probably should be a current officer or someone who has served as an officer in the past. I think it's kind of dangerous to have someone serving as an officer in a first time in a high-level position. So there's really no right answer to these questions. Just gotta try and find the best candidates that are willing to serve your club. Things to also consider are, the age of your club. If you're a newer club, you'll have people with less leadership experience. So this is a great opportunity to give them a chance to build on their leadership experience. Remember that everybody is working on their leadership skills, and being an officer can be a great opportunity. So you really want to sell that to potential candidates. Let's talk about a timeline. So really, everyone should have already started their succession planning and this process now. But in the future, you want to really start as early as possible. I like to tell people that, no sooner do you become an officer, you should probably start thinking about succession planning. It's important because it does take a while to really identify good candidates. I know it's not always possible early in the year, but definitely mid-year you should be thinking about approaching good candidates for replacing you in your current position. Elections ideally should be done the first week of your first meeting in May. And we'll talk more about why that's important. At the latest, you want to have your election before your first meeting in June. So it's really important that you try and have the election process soon rather than later. And we'll talk more about that. So let's talk about your nominations committee. So who serves on your nominations committee? Well, traditionally, your immediate past president would be the chair of the nominations committee. That's sort of a Toastmasters tradition to have the immediate past president serve as your committee chair. Other committee members you want to look for are experienced Toastmasters who have either been an officer in the past or are very familiar with the Toastmasters program. You want to make sure that your nominations committee no one is running for an officer position. So your nomination committee might be small, no more than 2 or 3 members. So what is the minimum number of officers? So let's just say you're in a club that you're not going to be able to fill all 7 of the officer roles. What's the minimum number that you can work with? And your nomination committee should be aware of this. So every club must have a club president at least one of the vice president's positions. So that could be either vice president of education, membership, or PR. And you must have at least a secretary. Ideally, you might want to double that up with the treasurer position. So one position, the only position that Toastmasters officially recognizes as a combination position is secretary/treasurer. That is ideally the minimum number. So 3 officers, no less. So when do you announce nominations? It's a good idea to at least announce nominations the meeting prior to when you will actually be having elections. If you can do it, 2 meetings before, that's fine. But at the minimum, you want to announce who your officers, who the nomination committee has identified as potential officers for the upcoming year, at least 1 meeting prior to the actual elections. The reasons why we have this nominations process is we want to make sure we're going through a fair selection process. That's why none of the candidates should be on the nominating committee. You don't really get to see a nominations process, in other organizations, maybe in politics, but really it's something that's very unique. And we want to make sure that the process is fair as possible, and that we're really looking at, the nomination committee should really be looking at trying to find the best team of officers absolutely possible. And so this is probably the most important question, So how do you do a nominations process at the club level? We have our process for nominations at the district level where people submit applications. What I have found very effective for a nominations committee is just asking every member what their level of interest is. One of the resources, and we'll get into that right now, one of the resources that we're going to provide online is going to be what I've used in the past is a nomination interest form. It's a very simple form. You could probably create it yourself, but it just basically lists the 7 officer positions. So as the nominating chair, I usually, several meetings prior to when we're going to announce when the slate of officers, I'll hand out these interest forms to every member at the club. Those that aren't there, I might email it to them. But basically, the form asks them to just rank, what positions they're interested in, in what order. Might have a section at the bottom that says, why would you be interested in running for this position? So this is great because it gives you an idea of where everyone in your club stands. You can quickly eliminate people who say, I'm absolutely not interested in being an officer, and then quickly identify, what people are interested in, and then that way you can sort them by their interest in their position and sort of whittle it down to figure out your slate of officers. It is important that everyone also get a description of the officer role. So we are going to send that also out as a resource, another handout that you can give to your club members, which is just sort of a snapshot of what every officer position is and what their responsibilities are. The nominating committee should, once they go through these interest forms and figure out, who's interested in one position, should reach out to the candidates before announcing that they have been selected, and ask them, do you accept the nomination? So you do want to have a conversation with each member that's going to be on your slate of officers for the nominations announcement. So you want to do that ahead of time. Another great resource for members and for the succession planning is the Club Leadership Handbook. So current officers should all have a copy. You may even want to share some information from the leadership handbook with potential candidates. Let them know that there is that resource out there for when they become a club officer. You may also want to mention other items like the training we do, the TLIs, things like that, so that they know that in accepting their leadership role that there is resources and there will be training available for them. So let's talk about the election process. So it's election day, and now you're ready to select your officers. So let's just talk about a couple of items under parliamentary procedures. So in Toastmasters, we use Robert's Rules of Order as our guiding principles for parliamentary procedures. The important thing with parliamentary procedure, the first thing you want to make sure is that your club, you have a quorum. So what is a quorum? So Robert's Rules defines a quorum as the sort of the majority of members in your club. So simple process would think if you have 20 members in your club, a majority would be at least 11. So it's about 50% plus 1. So that's a majority, and that's all you really need is a simple majority in order to have elections. So it's very important that before you even go forward with your elections, that whatever meeting you're having elections, that you have that quorum. Voting. So voting should always be done, if necessary, by secret ballot. Let's talk about, the order of voting. So if you're in a club that does have contested officer positions, you would start with the election of president, then move down to vice president of education, membership, PR, secretary, treasurer, and then sergeant at arms. Giving any candidates that may have been running for a higher position the opportunity to run for another position. So let's say, for example, you had a contested position for club president. One person is voted in. You should then, before you start the next elections, open any nominations from the floor. You actually should start with that as well for the position of president, asking if there are any nominations from the floor. Always have that in every step for every officer position. Even if there's only one person running for that position, it's someone may change their mind or may decide, you know what, I want to run for this position. So we always want to give our members the opportunity to run for any positions from the floor. And that's a simple, motion, process in asking for that nomination. It should be seconded by another member. And then once you've established who the candidates are, you can give them some time to address the club. Typically, 2 minutes is pretty much the standard good operating time to give to each candidate to express why they should be elected towards that position. And then you would do the secret ballots where every member at the meeting would vote. And that's why you have to have a quorum, have that number that is a majority in case you have to have a vote. So once you've completed the entire voting process, it is the responsibility of the club secretary, if not the club president, to make sure that the new slate of officers is reported to Toastmasters International. So making sure you submit your club officers list on time. That should be done prior to June 30th for the next year. So Toastmasters International can start setting up your new club officers with their roles through our website. So they'll have access to adding new members, paying dues, and other submitting educational awards, things like that. So it's very important that you get your officer lists in on time. So resources that are available will be available for you. We are going to post online a parliamentary procedure summary, most of the items that I discussed with you, a how to vote summary as well. And then also it's a good idea, we won't post it, but it is available online, or you might want to get one for your club, is a copy of Robert's Rules of Order in case you do run into some parliamentary procedure items. But a lot of our elections at the club level do mirror what we do at the district level. So if you've ever seen a district level elections, that is pretty much the process that I mentioned in the selection process, in the election process. And that concludes our presentation, and we are going to move to Q&A.